You notice it wrong before you notice it at all. That is the particular quality of the thing. You are standing on Stable Yard Road, the narrow passage that runs along the eastern flank of Clarence House, and your eye moves across the scene the way a tourist's eye always moves, taking inventory, filing impressions, building the mental photograph. The stone, the guards, the flags when they are flying, the particular weight of a London morning pressing down on a building that has been standing since 1825. And then your eye catches it, and something in your brain sends up a small flag of its own. The fence, not the iron railings that line so much of royal London, those tall, black, spike-top barriers that speak the same language as the buildings they protect, formal, permanent, expensive, designed to communicate authority without having to say a word about it. Not that. This is chain link, the kind of fence you associate with the perimeter of a car park, or a secondary school's sports ground, or a construction site on a B road somewhere outside Swindon. Silver gray metal wire, woven into diamonds, mounted on utilitarian posts, sitting against the ancient stone of one of the most quietly prestigious addresses in Britain, with all the elegance of a temporary solution that someone forgot to make permanent. Most people photograph it, not because it is beautiful, because it is wrong, because it sits in the visual field the way a grammatical error sits in a formal letter, not catastrophic, not illegible, but impossible to unsee once you have seen it. You take your photograph, you show it to the person next to you. One of you says something like they couldn't afford proper railings, and the other laughs and you move on, and you never find out that what you just photographed is not a mistake, not an oversight, not a budget shortfall, and not temporary at all. It has been there for years. It was put there deliberately. And the reason it exists is standing somewhere in this story, approximately halfway through, in the form of a tourist not entirely unlike yourself. Start with what Clarence House is, because most people who visit London do not fully know, and the not knowing matters for what comes later. Clarence House is not Buckingham Palace. This sounds obvious, but the distinction runs deeper than geography. Buckingham Palace is a public-facing institution. It is designed at some fundamental level to be looked at: the balcony, the forecourt, the changing of the guard, the entire theatrical apparatus of a building that knows it is being watched and has organized itself accordingly. Clarence House is something different. It sits behind St. James's Palace, tucked into the southwest corner of a part of London that tourists pass through rather than stop in, and it has always cultivated a particular quality of deliberate invisibility. Not secrecy, invisibility, there is a difference. The building takes its name from the Duke of Clarence, later King William IV, who commissioned John Nash to convert it from a set of Grey Sanfavo apartments into a unified residence in the 1820s. Nash, who was also responsible for the terraces around Regent's Park and the reconstruction of Buckingham Palace, gave Clarence House the same quality he gave everything he designed, a kind of restrained authority that communicates importance without insisting on it. The building does not lean toward you. It sits back. It expects you to understand what it is without being told. It has housed, over its nearly 2 centuries of existence, a succession of residents whose relationship to the public spotlight ranged from reluctant to actively hostile. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, lived here for the last 50 years of her life. The late Queen, as Princess Elizabeth, lived here briefly after her marriage. King Charles III, then Prince of Wales, made it his primary London residence for decades. The building has a relationship with public attention that is long, complicated, and fundamentally shaped by the preference of its occupants for a particular kind of privacy that is not about hiding, but about maintaining the quiet authority that disappears the moment you have to defend it loudly. This is the context in which the security around Clarence House has always operated. Not invisible exactly. There are guards. There have always been guards. The police presence on Stable Yard Road is not hidden, is not designed to be hidden. is not the kind of security that depends on concealment for its effectiveness, but it is understated in a way that reflects the building's general preference for authority that does not need to wave its arms. The iron railings where they exist are proper iron railings. The barriers are where they need to be. The sight lines are managed without being announced. And for a long time, for decades, arguably for most of the building's working life as a residential royal palace, there was no chain-link fence. To understand why the fence eventually appeared, you need to understand what the space around Clarence House looked like before it. And more specifically, you need to understand the particular social physics of how tourists behave in proximity to royal residences in London. There is a set of informal rules that governs this behavior, and they are informal in the most literal sense. Nobody writes them down. Nobody announces them. They are not posted on signs. They are not explained to visitors. They are transmitted by atmosphere, by the quality of attention in a space, by the way other people around you are behaving, which tells you without words, without instruction, how close is close enough and where the invisible line sits. These informal rules work almost all the time. They work because most people, confronted with the weight of a building like Clarence House and the quiet authority of the guards who stand outside it, calibrate their behavior accordingly. They photograph from a respectful distance. They speak in slightly lower voices than usual. They do not test the edges of what is permitted because the atmosphere of the place communicates, with considerable precision, that the edges are not the interesting part. The interesting part is the building, the history, the sense of standing next to something very old and very serious that is going about its business with complete indifference to whether you are impressed by it. For most tourists, this is enough. For most tourists, the informal rules hold without effort, without enforcement, without the need for any physical barrier to make the boundary legible. The boundary is legible because it is a social fact, and social facts in the right atmosphere are as solid as iron railings. The problem with social facts, as anyone who has spent time watching tourist crowds will tell you, is that they are only as strong as the social consensus that holds them in place. And social consensus. In a crowd of strangers from 40 different countries with 40 different relationships to public space and royal tradition, and the particular British grammar of respectful distance, is a more fragile thing than it appears. It takes, sometimes, remarkably little to dissolve it. The tourist in question, and there was a tourist, a specific person, a specific moment, though the institutional record does not name them and the police logs from that period do not illuminate them with any particular biographical detail. The tourist in question was not dangerous. This is worth establishing clearly because the story could be misread as being about a threat, and it is not. The person in question did not represent a security risk in any conventional sense. They were not carrying anything they should not have been carrying. They were not attempting to enter the building. They were not acting with any apparent hostile intent toward the residence or its occupants. What they were doing was performing. There is a specific kind of tourist behavior that emerges in crowds, particularly in crowds gathered around something famous, something guarded, something that carries an implicit instruction not to touch. The behavior is driven by a fairly basic social dynamic. The presence of an audience, combined with a rule that seems arbitrary or class-based or simply English in a way that can feel faintly absurd to someone who did not grow up inside the cultural logic that produced it, can generate a specific impulse. The impulse is to mock the rule by breaking it just enough to get a laugh. Not to destroy anything, not to hurt anyone, just to get a little closer than you are supposed to get, to pull a face at the guard, to lean past the notional line in a way that says to your fellow tourists, look how seriously they take all this. Look how rigid and ceremonial and fundamentally comic this whole apparatus is. Watch me demonstrate that the emperor has no clothes. It is, when you strip it back, a performance of sophistication. A way of signaling to your audience that you are not taken in by the pageantry, that you see through the theater of it, that you are worldly enough to find the whole thing slightly ridiculous. The crowd laughed. Of course the crowd laughed. Crowds almost always laugh at this kind of performance, because the performer has constructed a situation in which laughter is the socially correct response. To not laugh is to side with the institution, to reveal yourself as the kind of person who takes royal residences seriously, which is, in the microculture of that particular tourist crowd, on that particular morning, apparently a thing to be avoided. The guards did not laugh. The guards, who are trained for precisely this kind of situation, and whose training is specifically designed to produce the response of complete, impassive, almost geological stillness, did exactly what they are trained to do. They held their position. They maintained their expression. They did not react in any way that gave the performer more material to work with. But the performer had already gotten what they came for. The crowd had moved, not dramatically, not dangerously, but the social consensus about where the line was had shifted in that moment by the precise amount required to make it no longer a reliable boundary. Other people had seen that you could get a little closer, that the invisible line was, apparently, negotiable, that the atmosphere of the place was not, in fact, as solid a barrier as it had seemed. The informal rule had been tested. And once an informal rule is tested in public, and the tester walks away without consequence, the rule's authority is diminished, not destroyed, diminished, enough that the next person in the next crowd and the person after that and the crowd after that would, at the margins, behave slightly differently than they would have behaved before. This is how social thresholds erode, not through dramatic assault, through incremental demonstration that the threshold is softer than it appears. The people responsible for the security of Clarence House are not naive about crowd psychology. They are, in fact, among the most thoroughly briefed people in Britain on the specific ways in which public spaces around royal residences behave and misbehave, and the cascading effects of small boundary violations on the behavior of subsequent crowds. They had seen this dynamic before. Not at Clarence House specifically, perhaps, but the phenomenon of one tourist's performance shifting the social consensus of a crowd, of a single visible transgression recalibrating, for every observer, what level of approach was apparently acceptable. This was not a new problem. It is, in the language of security professionals who think about these things, a threshold cascade. One person crosses a line. The line moves. The next person crosses it in its new position. The line moves again. You do not wait for the cascade to develop. You respond to the first movement. The response that came was not dramatic. It was not announced. There was no press release, no public explanation, no acknowledgement from the palace or from any of the security apparatus attached to it that anything had changed or that anything had prompted the change. That is, characteristically, not how these things are handled. What happened was simpler and more pragmatic than any announcement would have been. The fence appeared. Chain link fencing is not, by most aesthetic measures, a beautiful material. This is not a controversial statement. It is not the kind of fencing that anyone specifying materials for a project involving a 200-year-old Nash-designed royal residence would choose if the primary criterion were visual harmony. It does not complement the Portland stone. It does not echo the iron railings that mark so much of this part of London. It does not, in the vocabulary of the built environment, say anything that the building itself says. What chain link fencing does, which is the reason it was chosen, and the reason the choice was correct, and the reason it has remained in place through subsequent decades and subsequent security reviews, is create a physical and psychological boundary at a precise distance from a building, without inviting engagement with the boundary itself. This requires some explanation, because it is not immediately obvious, and the non-obviousness of it is part of why most people who see the fence read it as a mistake rather than a decision. Ornamental fencing, The kind of iron railings that run along the front of Buckingham Palace, for instance, is, paradoxically, an invitation. It is tall enough to be impassable but interesting enough to approach. People put their hands on it. They put their faces between the bars. They lean against it for photographs. They interact with it as an object because it is a beautiful object, and the interaction, though it stops short of crossing the boundary the fence defines, nonetheless requires them to stand at the fence itself, which is to say, at the precise edge of the space the fence is meant to protect. This is not what you want. What you want, what the security logic of a building like Clarence House requires, is a boundary that people observe from a distance rather than approach and touch. A boundary that communicates at a register below conscious thought that this is not an interesting object. This is not something to put your hand on. This is not something worth getting close to. Chainlink does this. Not because it is frightening, not because it communicates aggression or hostility, but because it is boring. Because it is the fence you walk past on a building site without breaking stride. Because it has no aesthetic invitation built into it, no quality that rewards close examination, no reason to approach it except to approach it, which is, in the absence of any other reason, not something most people do. The height is specific. The distance from the building is specific. The placement relative to the existing guard positions is specific. None of this was accidental, and none of it was cheap in the sense of being thoughtless, even if it was cheap in the sense of costing less per meter than ornamental ironwork. The ugliness is the function. The fence looks like a temporary solution because temporary solutions do not invite the same relationship that permanent, beautiful things invite. They say, this is a working boundary, not an ornamental one. They say, the distance between you and this building is a practical matter, not a ceremonial one. They say in the most efficient possible way, stay here. And people stay there. Not because they are told to, not because a guard instructs them, because the fence, in its deliberate plainness, in its complete absence of visual interest, creates a stopping point that requires no enforcement. You reach it and there is nothing to do but stop, because the fence offers nothing that would reward going further. The informal rule, which had been tested and found soft, was replaced by a physical fact. Physical facts do not erode under tourist crowds. Physical facts do not shift when someone performs for an audience. Physical facts do not require social consensus to maintain their authority. The fence holds the line that the atmosphere, on that specific morning with that specific crowd, failed to hold. There is a particular quality to the way old British institutions solve problems, and it is worth naming it directly because it appears in this story in one of its purest forms. The quality is this: the solution is deployed without explanation. The problem is addressed efficiently and permanently, and the addressing of it is not narrated to the public, is not framed as a response to anything, is not packaged with a rationale or a backstory or any acknowledgement that a problem existed in the first place. The thing simply appears in its solved form, and the institution carries on. This is sometimes read as arrogance, as the secretiveness of establishments that believe themselves unaccountable, as institutions closing ranks and refusing to explain themselves to the people whose taxes, indirectly or directly, pay for the thing being protected. This reading is not entirely wrong. But there is another reading, which is that institutions with very long memories have learned something about the relationship between explanations and vulnerabilities. To explain why the fence was installed is to document, precisely, the behavior that prompted its installation. To document that behavior is to create a record of exactly what kind of action produced exactly what kind of institutional response. To create that record is to publish, for anyone who wishes to read it, a partial map of the threshold between behavior that is tolerated and behavior that causes change. You do not want that map to exist. So the fence appears. No statement accompanies it. No journalist is briefed. No public record articulates the sequence from mocking tourist to chain-link perimeter. The problem and its solution are connected only in the institutional memory of the people who were present, who made the decision, and who will not, in most cases, be writing their memoirs about it. The rest of us piece it together from the fence itself, which is, if you think about it, a fairly elegant form of communication. The message is, something happened here that required this. The message does not say what. It does not need to say what. The fence is both the response and the redaction of the incident that prompted the response, standing on stable yard road in its utilitarian plainness, saying nothing, holding the line. Here is what you now know that you did not know when you started reading. You know that the chain-link fence at Clarence House is not a mistake, not a temporary installation left in place by oversight, not a budget decision made by someone who did not understand what they were working with. It is a deliberate instrument, placed at a deliberate distance, made of a deliberate material chosen specifically because that material is uninteresting. You know that Clarence House operates on a principle of understated authority, a building that does not announce itself, guarded by a security apparatus that prefers quiet permanence to visible drama, surrounded for most of its history by informal rules that held because the atmosphere of the place made them hold. You know that informal rules are fragile in ways that are not visible until the moment they are tested. That a single tourist, performing for a crowd, playing to an audience that laughed, shifted a social threshold by a small but measurable amount. That the shifting of that threshold was not catastrophic, was not a crisis, was not a security failure in any dramatic sense, but was enough to demonstrate that the informal rule was no longer doing the work required of it. You know that the institutional response was to replace the informal rule with a physical fact, and that the physical fact was chosen not for its beauty, but for its specific psychological effect, the effect of an uninteresting object, which is that people do not approach it without purpose, and tourists walking past a royal residence on a London morning almost never have a purpose that requires them to approach the fence. You know that the decision was made without announcement and will likely never be formally documented, and that this silence is not negligence but strategy, the deliberate refusal to publish a map of institutional vulnerabilities for the benefit of anyone who might want to probe them. And you know, if you have been paying attention to the logic that runs underneath all of this, that the fence is not an eyesore in the way you first read it. It is an eyesore in a much more specific sense. It is an object that was designed to look wrong, to look temporary, to look boring, to generate exactly the mild confusion and faint aesthetic disappointment that you experienced when you first saw it. Because that mild confusion and faint aesthetic disappointment is the precise response that keeps you standing where you are standing and not moving any closer. The fence works on you, even as you read about how it works. That is not an accident. Most people who photograph the fence today do so with the particular energy of someone who has found something that does not belong. There is something almost gleeful about it. The chain link against the Nash stonework, the utilitarian against the historic, the construction site against the palace. It is a good photograph in the way that incongruity is always a good photograph. It captures something that feels like a mistake, and photographs of mistakes have a specific currency on the internet, because they invite the viewer to feel briefly superior to the institution that made the error. Except there was no error. What there was a decision made by people who understood something that the photographer standing on Stable Yard Road does not yet understand. That a fence which looks wrong is, in this specific context, a fence that is doing its job correctly. That the wrongness is the point. That the institution, which has been managing this particular piece of London, and the people who come to look at it for 2 centuries, has learned something about the relationship between appearance and function that is considerably more sophisticated than it looks. The tourist who photographed it with confusion is, in a very small way, part of the same dynamic as the tourist who caused it to be installed. Both arrived at the fence with a particular reading. This looks wrong. This looks comic. This looks like something the establishment has gotten wrong, and both were, in arriving at that reading, demonstrating precisely the effect the fence was designed to produce. The fence tells you it doesn't belong. It tells you this because an object that doesn't belong is an object that doesn't invite touch. You read it as a mistake. It reads you as exactly the kind of visitor. It was designed to stop at exactly this distance. There is something worth sitting with in the gap between what the fence looks like and what it is. Not a grand lesson, not a sweeping conclusion about institutions or history or the British establishment's relationship with transparency. Something quieter than that. Something more specific to the particular dynamic of a building that has been doing the same job for 2 centuries, surrounded by a city that has changed almost beyond recognition around it, managing an endless procession of visitors who arrive with cameras and mild confusion, and the very reasonable assumption that what they are seeing is what it appears to be. The fence appears to be a mistake. It is not a mistake. And the institution that placed it there will not tell you this, will not tell you about the tourist, about the crowd that laughed, about the threshold that moved by a small and measurable amount on a specific morning and never quite moved back, will not explain the choice of chain link over iron, the height, the placement, the deliberate plainness of an object sitting against a very beautiful building. It will simply stand there on Stable Yard Road, in all its utilitarian wrongness, doing what it was built to do, which is, in the end, the only explanation it has ever needed to offer. You were stopped. You are still standing here. The fence worked.